Hello and welcome to our podcast for college Catholics, where we discuss faith and spirituality from a Catholic perspective. I'm Father Patrick. In our previous episode, we spoke about some sins against the 6th and the 9th commandments. They are, you shall not commit adultery, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. So today we will consider some further sins against purity, particularly insofar as they affect the covenant of marriage. Now, as we mentioned before, these commandments are like a summary that include many other obligations in the spiritual life of each Christian faithful. Above all, they imply a positive call to practice the virtues of chastity and modesty. They imply an understanding of the human nature as created by God in His own image as male and female, called to form a society based on the unit of the family. They also imply that the reality of marriage is an institution created by God as a stable union between one man and one woman for life. So let's talk a little bit about what marriage is and the purpose of the marital acts. In the Catechism, particularly number 1601, we read that marriage is an institution created by God. It says, marriage is a stable union, a covenant, by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole life, which is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ, the Lord, to the dignity of a sacrament. And it's quoting there the Code of Canon Law, number 1055. So we see that the purpose of marriage is twofold. It has as its purpose the well-being of the spouses, that is, their human well-being and their eternal salvation, of course, and also the bringing of children to this world and their education. For more on this, you could listen to the past episodes I published on marriage, which are numbers 113 through 120 of this same podcast show. Now, from the purpose of marriage, we can also conclude the purpose of the marital acts, or if you want, the meaning and purpose of the sexual acts. These sexual acts, for them to be morally licit or valid before God, they must be performed, or they are meant to be performed, only between a husband and a wife. And their goal is to foster the union and good of the spouses themselves, and second, the transmission of life, or at least the openness to the possibility of transmitting life. These two purposes of the marital act cannot be separated. They should not be separated, or sought one with the intentional exclusion of the other. Otherwise, this would compromise the nature of that marital act, and therefore offend God gravely. God, who is the creator of marriage and of the sexual act itself. Now, there is another element in the marital act, which is intended by God, which is the sensual pleasure obtained through the marital encounter of husband and wife. As long as it's pursued in an orderly way and in a spirit of mutual respect, this pleasure or sexual or sensual pleasure is licit, and it is intended to foster the intimacy and love between spouses, and ultimately their union. It can also help to satisfy the sexual desire which is natural in men and women. It is even licit to seek the sexual encounter, even if it is initially desired for the sensual pleasure itself, as long as it leads to the union of the spouses and it's open to life. The Catechism quotes a discourse by Pope Pius XII, which says the following: the Creator Himself established that in the generative function, spouses should experience pleasure and enjoyment of body and spirit. Therefore, the spouses do nothing evil in seeking this pleasure and enjoyment. Now, once we have understood the principles and the nature of the marital act, we can look at the sins against marriage, sins that hurt or damage the nature of marriage, and in the sense, they go against the persons involved and against God. We've already spoken about the most evident sins in the previous episode. That is the sin of adultery, or when a married person has sexual relations with someone who is not their spouse. The sin of viewing pornography, or the sin of impurely desiring someone who is not one's spouse. An important clarification is that today there are many people who, after being married validly, they decide to divorce their spouse in a civil court and then remarry a different person before a civil authority. They are actually still married to their first spouse because that marriage was valid before God. And that spousal bond, that marriage bond, cannot be dissolved by any human being. Therefore, if they start living with another person, if they remarry in a civil court, while being in reality sacramentally married to the first person, supposing that that person hasn't died, they are living in a situation of sin, and they commit adultery each time they have relations. And these are mortal sins. That is very clear from the Lord's words in the Gospel, which you can read in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 11 through 12. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Now, if a married man desires to have relations with a woman who is not his wife, even if they don't actually have physical relationships, physical sexual relations, he commits adultery. He commits the sin of adultery in his heart, as we read in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 5, verse 28. Jesus says, "But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And that is a grave sin as well. Committing not physical adultery, but spiritual, we could say spiritual adultery, when that desire is consented, of course. Actually, all the sins committed against the 6th and 9th commandments constitute grave matter. A similar sin is that of cohabitating with a partner, even if it is right before the wedding, or if it is, as some people call it, a trial marriage, even if it is for financial reasons, which is a common excuse for living together without being married. The understanding of the Church is that if one is living together with one's couple, they are also typically having sexual relations, which is why this idea of cohabitating when one is not married adds also the sin of scandal. Now let us look at another sin or other sins within marriage. One common sin is that of onanism, which comes from the action of a man from the Old Testament called Onan. In Genesis chapter 38, verses 8 and 9, we read that Judah tells his son, Onan, to have relations with Tamar. Now, Tamar was the widow of Onan's older brother, Er, who had died. So the idea in the Jewish law was that the brother of the dead man would marry his widowed wife to bring progeny to his dead brother. But each time Onan would have intercourse with Tamar, he would remove himself during the sexual act and spill the seed on the ground to avoid conceiving. And this displeased God greatly. So we read in the book of Genesis, chapter 38. Onan, however, knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground to avoid giving offspring to his brother. What he did greatly offended God, and the Lord took his life too. So that is the sin of onanism. Now the Catechism outlines at length some other sins connected to marriage or against marriage. On the one hand, there is the sin of contraception, and on the other hand, the sins connected to artificial insemination and fertilization, or briefly put, what we call in vitro fertilization or IVF, more popularly known as IVF, which it could be a bit surprising that it is outlined as a sin against the sixth commandment, but there it is in the Catechism. So before explaining what these sins are about, it is important to understand the doctrine behind them and why it is that these attitudes are immoral. First, let's talk about the sin of contraception. We mentioned the sin of onanism, which could be considered an old-fashioned way of contraception. We should say first that human love between a man and a woman tends naturally toward a stable and exclusive relationship, that is, toward marriage. And that love, which is perfected in marriage, has as a goal the union between the spouses, the good of the spouses, and the begetting and educating of children. So there's a unitive goal and a procreative goal, both in marriage and in the sexual marital acts. And this inseparable connection between the unity and the procreative ends of the sexual act must not be broken by the spouses. In the case of contraception, the spouses try to leave out the procreative aspect of the marital intercourse. As Pope St. Paul VI said in his well-known encyclical, Humanae Vitae, numbers 11 and 12. The Church teaches that it is necessary that each and every marriage act must remain in and of itself ordered to the procreation of human life. This particular doctrine of the Church, continues the Pope, is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marital act. Up to there, Pope Paul VI. So when a couple intentionally and actively leaves out one of the two purposes of the marital act, they commit sin. When the procreative aspect is left out, we have the sin of contraception. And the unitive aspect is left out typically through IVF or surrogacy, or so many other technologies which we have addressed in an episode in this podcast. Actually, you can check episode 182 in an interview I did with Dr. Janet Smith. So, and this is important, the sin of contraception implies two simultaneous choices to commit the sin of contraception. On the one hand, the choice to have a marital sexual act, and at the same time, wanting it to be infertile or causing it to be infertile by applying some external barrier or instrument or drug, like a condom or an intrauterine device, also called IUD, or the pill. It is important to remember that the Holy Father, Pope Paul VI, indicated in Humanae Vitae 14 that the act of contraception is always illicit. And there are no surrounding circumstances that would make contraception a moral or licit option. That is, it is always immoral, regardless of the circumstances like poverty or already having too many children or health difficulties, etc., to commit the act of contraception. In other words, the sin of contraception is intrinsically evil. The Catechism in number 2370 says, quoting Pope Paul VI, "Every action which, whether in anticipation of the conjugal act, or in its accomplishment, or in the development of its natural consequences, proposes, whether as an end or as a means to render procreation impossible, is intrinsically evil. So just as a clarification to this clear statement, there are some cases where a doctor may prescribe a medication that helps regulate the female cycle in order to become pregnant. These medications may sometimes cause a momentary infertility, so they are basically a sort of contraceptive medication. But if that medication is not taken to avoid having children, but to cure the irregularity of the woman, that action is not the sin of contraception. On the other hand, it is licit for spouses to, on certain occasions and for just reasons, to choose to space the births of children, and they can do this by abstaining from having relations during the fertile periods of the wife, while having relations during the infertile periods of the wife. So this is what is commonly called natural family planning, and this is totally licit. Now, I know I usually promise to keep these episodes short, but it is worth in this case to explain a little bit about the concept, the context, or events surrounding the publication of the encyclical Humanae Vitae. So I'll extend myself a little bit here. The contraceptive pill was approved in the United States by the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. Those were also the years of the sexual revolution. The Vatican circulated the idea that there would be a document coming out soon about the morality of contraception, which had, until then, always been considered morally evil or sinful by the Catholic Church and even by most Christian denominations. So this started to create an environment of uncertainty in the church, and several theologians purposely started to suggest strongly that the Catholic Church should change her stance on contraception. Now, to further complicate things, Pope Paul VI convened a commission of medical experts and scientists to have himself more information about the physiological aspects of contraception. But instead of limiting themselves to scientific conclusions, they almost all unanimously recommended that he, the Pope, should change the moral teaching on contraception. And what's worse, then they leaked their opinion to the public. So this put a lot of pressure on Pope Paul VI. However, in spite of all this pressure from theologians and scientists, Pope St. Paul VI wrote his encyclical Humanae Vitae, stating irreversibly and infallibly that the magisterium of the Church always considered and continues to affirm that the act of contraception is always morally illicit, no matter the circumstances. Now, the day after the release of the encyclical to the public, Charles Curran, a Catholic priest who taught theology at the Catholic University of America, together with many other theologians, wrote a statement of dissent opposing the teaching of Pope Paul VI, which was later, purposely, publicized by the New York Times and even supported by some other 600 dissenting theologians. So that's a lot of pressure. That dissent basically said two things that are, of course, wrong. First, that there was no obligation to obey the encyclical by Pope Paul VI because it was not infallible, they said. And second, that spouses could choose whether they would use contraception or not according to their own consciences. Charles Curran and his group of theologians, dissenting theologians, said that their position, self-styled the magisterium of the theologians, quote unquote, opposed the magisterium of the Pope in this point, and that they had the right to do it and even the obligation to do so. Of course, that attitude is wrong, and it caused a great scandal because many other priests and theologians, even sometimes bishops, followed their parallel teaching to their parallel magisterium, let's say, their parallel teaching. This was the reason why many priests in the confessional would recommend married people that they could practice contraception if their conscience told them to do so. So they put the opinion of one's own conscience above the moral teachings of the Catholic Church. So this was the result of that dissent of pseudo-Catholic theologians against the magisterium of the Holy Father. So, to summarize the proper teaching, the Church teaches that in connection with the marital act, the act of contraception is always gravely sinful. That is, as Humanae Vitae number 14 says, quote, "Every action which, whether in anticipation of the conjugal act, or in its accomplishment, or in the development of its natural consequences, proposes, whether as an end or as a means, to render procreation impossible, is intrinsically evil." So up to there, a little bit about the context of the encyclical Humanae Vitae. So now, if you want to take a break of this episode, this is the moment to do it, because we're going to move on to another sin outlined in the Catechism. And the other type of sin connected to the marital act, or types of sins, are those sins connected to wanting to bring about the conception of human life, but outside the marital act, that is, without the natural sexual union between the spouses. So again, there's a separation between the ends of the marital act. In this case, seeking out procreation without the union of the spouses connected to it. That is what happens with the different scientific efforts to obtain the conception of children, which we could put under the general label of, quote, artificial insemination and fertilization. The ability of spouses to participate in the creative action of God by bringing a human being into life is surely and truly amazing. This is why the scriptures and the Catholic Church has always considered the begetting of life and large families as a blessing for the world. However, the ability to bring life to this world is always truly a gift of God. A child is not a right of the parents or something owed to them by God. Now, I have clear knowledge of the pain that it means for a couple not to be able to conceive a child. I have no doubt that it is very painful and a situation that is very difficult to understand, and it is a very heavy cross to bear. But the begetting of a new life is still a gift of God, and not something that the spouses should pursue at any cost whatsoever, or by any means possible. Because sometimes some of those means may be offensive to God, and they may be against the nature of the act of procreation and even hurtful to the children that are conceived. There are certain techniques, scientific techniques, which we could generally call in vitro fertilization. The fact that they can be done, thanks to science, does not mean that they are morally licit before God. Some of these techniques imply the harvesting of an egg or more from the wife and harvesting sperm from the husband, then fertilizing several eggs in a laboratory, and then reimplanting one or more fertilized eggs, which are now embryos, that is, actual human beings, in the womb of the mother, and then hope that one of them will successfully grow to be a baby. Several other embryos that are not implanted in the mother's womb could be discarded or frozen for future use, all of which is also gravely immoral. Now, this case that involves only the biological parents of the child is called homologous artificial insemination and fertilization, because the parents themselves are the ones who provide the seed and the egg for the embryo. Now, these techniques are morally sinful because the Church said in the document Donum Vitae from 1987 that they dissociate the sexual act from the procreative act. And I'm quoting the text here. The act which brings the child into existence is no longer an act by which two persons give themselves to one another, but one that entrusts the life and identity of the embryo into the power of doctors and biologists, and establishes the domination of technology over the origin and destiny of the human person. Such a relationship of domination is in itself contrary to the dignity and equality that must be common to parents and children. Now, sometimes all this involves only, as I said before, the husband and the wife of the child, and that's the homologous artificial insemination and fertilization. But other times, the sperm is provided by a different man than the father, or the egg is provided by a different woman than the mother, and that woman is called the donor. Or what is sometimes stranger still, the fertilized embryo is not implanted in the wife's or mother's uterus, but in the uterus or womb of a different woman called a surrogate mother. So imagine this case. Suppose a woman wants to have a child. If the egg is donated by a different woman, and this happens frequently, and the baby is gestated in a surrogate womb of a third woman, then the child would have no biological connection at all to the legal mother. Now, this type of in vitro fertilization also is called heterologous artificial insemination and fertilization, is more reprehensible than the first one, because as the Catechism says, they infringe the child's right to be born of a father and mother known to him and bound to each other by marriage. They betray the spouse's right to become a father and a mother only through each other. Now, of course, having a child is truly something amazing. But we have to remember that a child is not something owed to one, but it is a gift from God. A child may not be considered a piece of property or a commodity, and in this sense there is no right to a child, as we read in number 2378 of the Catechism. Only the child possesses genuine rights. The right to be the fruit of the specific act of the conjugal love of his parents, and the right to be respected as a person from the moment of his conception. Now, while sterility or being unable to have a child is painful and difficult, and in a sense is something we would not wish to anyone, at the same time it is not an absolute evil. Spouses who can't have a child after exhausting all the morally licit medical treatments should see in these difficulties and hardships a cross that can bring them actually closer to Christ and closer to each other if they know how to carry it with a spirit of faith. This ability to carry one's own cross can bring about a great spiritual fecundity. Besides, they could also give expression to their generosity and their love to each other by adopting a child, which many times might have the child have been abandoned by his parents. Now, I don't want to create false hopes, but it does happen sometimes that spouses who couldn't have a child for several years, then they were able to conceive by the grace of God. Sometimes God grants his gifts whenever he wants, and after a long time of prayer and petition. A great example of children being conceived as a result of prayer is what has been happening for several years now at the Milk Grotto in Bethlehem, in Israel. This is a centuries-old tradition accepted by Christian and Muslim women alike. Not far from Bethlehem, and I will put a link to YouTube's stories about this and show notes. Not far from Bethlehem, maybe less than a half a mile from the Church of the Nativity of Christ, there's a church run by the Franciscans, which is basically a cave. And according to tradition, the Holy Family stopped sometime in this cave as they were fleeing to Egypt after the birth of Christ, when Herod was searching for the child to kill him. While in the cave, the Virgin Mary was feeding with the baby Jesus in this cave. The tradition is that some of the milk fell to the ground, and because of that, the rock of this cave has a whitish color. It is said that women that struggle with infertility can scrape some of the dust from this rock, mix it with water, and drink it. Now, there are hundreds of stories of women who were able to conceive after consuming some of that dust. When I went to Bethlehem several years ago, I was told about this milk grotto, so I visited it. And at the front office, near the door of the church, there were some binders with the pictures of the hundreds of babies conceived thanks to their mother's prayers at this grotto. So many times, what science cannot provide, God might want to provide as a response to prayer. And if for some reason God does not want to grant the child we were hoping for, we do know for certain that He has heard our prayers, and it is His will that is fulfilled in us. And this should always be a source of consolation and a way to help us carry our cross with Jesus Christ, who first died a painful death nailed to a cross for our salvation. So let us pray a Hail Mary for all those couples suffering with infertility, so that God may grant them the grace to conceive a child. Or if not, that He may give them the grace to carry this painful cross with fortitude, love, and faith. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So that will be all for today. Thank you so much for listening, even if it was a little longer episode this time. Please share this episode with your friends and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or even on YouTube. We hope to see you next time. May God bless your day.